The year was 1539. A group of priests seeking pilgrimage to the Holy Land were prevented by war. So instead they chose to go to Rome, where they pledged their allegiance to the Pope and swore to go wherever he sent them. This group, spearheaded by St. Ignatius of Loyola, was called the Jesuits, and they are responsible for ushering a new paradigm of papal authority, which eventually led to the pronouncement of papal infallibility. Welcome everyone to a series on the history of papal authority based on the Papal Primacy by Klaus Schatz. Today we are discussing the evolution of the papacy from the end of the Middle Ages to the Reformation. But first let's talk about a part of the world that we've neglected during the last couple parts of this series: the Byzantines. The last time we talked about the Byzantine Empire, which had evolved from the eastern half of the Roman Empire, we mentioned how Rome attempted to reconcile with them during the Council of Florence in the mid-15th century. These peace talks totally failed, though I suppose we never really talked about the definitive end of relations between Western Roman Christians, now known as Roman Catholics, and their Eastern counterparts, now known as Eastern Orthodox. Let's backtrack to the first millennium, whose final centuries were marked by increasing cultural, political, and theological differences between the Eastern Byzantine Empire and the emerging Western Holy Roman Empire. While the East struggled against both Islamic invaders and theological infighting, the West was growing in political prominence, and its theology became increasingly streamlined. As we've covered in previous episodes, Rome was able to centralize power among Western nations, but it was unable to exercise such authority in the East. This is because emperors like Charlemagne demanded cultural, political, and theological uniformity in the West, but they had no authority in the East. That didn't stop Rome from trying to exercise influence over the Byzantine Christians, though. And while the East never stopped seeing Rome as a first among equals of theological powers, Rome's increasing interference came to bother them, significantly. By the 11th century, Rome was culturally Latinizing Eastern Christian communities across Europe, and in 1054, Rome would not so delicately place the straw that broke the camel's back. Rome decreed that a certain phrase should be added to the Nicene Creed. You know, the creed we say every Sunday after the homily. This phrase was originally, "I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father." Rome changed it to "who proceeds from the Father and the Son." Now to us that may not seem like a big deal. After all, by that time, many theologians believed it was acceptable to think that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. The bigger problem was in modifying a centuries-old creed that both sides had agreed never to alter. For the Greeks, this was it. Rome had already attempted to Latinize their churches enough. Changing the creed, especially without Byzantine consent, meant divorce. So mutual excommunications were issued. Now, were these intended to be permanent? Arguably no, which is what makes the matter so tragic. For the last couple of centuries, Rome and its Eastern counterparts had been excommunicating each other on and off, like a bad breakup that wouldn't stick. I highly doubt either side believed that this was truly the end. But here we are in 2025 with two separate churches. Even at the bitter end, though, Eastern bishops and theologians still respected Rome as having primacy among other patriarchal churches. One theologian wrote, "But the Roman Church, whose primacy among these sisters, the Eastern churches, we do not deny, and whose foremost rank in honor as presider at a general council we acknowledge, has separated from us because of its pride, seized an autocratic rule that does not belong to its office, and the divided bishops of West and East as the empire itself is divided." At the end of the day, it seems that the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches arguably split not because of a theological dispute, but because of political and cultural differences. And that's how Christianity was split. Dang. It's a good thing Rome learned its lesson and that never happened again, right? Well, let's pick up from where we left off last episode. For half a century in the 1300s, we hardly knew who the Pope was due to the three popes controversy. Once Rome resolved that, the papacy spent the next half a century battling against cardinals who sought to restrain his authority. By the time we hit the 1500s, the papacy had spent so much of its time in power struggles and scandal that it had largely lost touch with its flock. Furthermore, powerful bishops continued amassing wealth, spending it on lavish projects rather than the poor. Also, by this point, the Pope's political allies had realized that even though he crowned them, realistically, they had far more authority over him than he did over them. And in 1515, one troubled Augustinian monk visited Rome, expecting to find spiritual refreshment. Instead, he was disgusted at the wealth and the extravagance of those he pledged obedience to. He was particularly taken aback by the construction of an ornate basilica that was largely funded by bishops promising reduced time in purgatory in exchange for donations, a practice known as indulgences. This man was named Martin Luther. Luther didn't set to break away from the church at first, and at first his suggestions for reform, summarized in a document called the 95 Theses, were actually received by theologians for cordial debate. But as Luther went increasingly public with his grievances about the hierarchy, and his grievances turned into attacks against long-held church doctrines, he was reprimanded by his superiors and eventually excommunicated in 1521. Here's the problem. The Pope gravely, and I mean gravely, underestimated Luther's ability. A skilled orator, he managed to court princes and kings from several nations who backed his form of Christianity over that of Rome's. The papacy at the time was preoccupied with political affairs and likely did not expect Luther's movement to gain such momentum. It took over 20 years for the papacy to meaningfully respond to Protestantism at the Council of Trent, which began in 1545. This council lasted 18 years, and it clarified and restated dozens of Catholic teachings, though it almost abruptly ended because of one controversial issue: papal authority. The codification of the Pope as a powerful unilateral authority at the council was pushed by a newly formed religious order which had attempted to go to the Holy Land but was prevented by war. Since they couldn't go to the Holy Land, they promised to go wherever the Pope sent them. This order was called the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. The Jesuits sought to establish that the Pope has supreme authority over the Church at the Council of Trent, but the topic was so controversial that it nearly cut the council short. So the matter was dropped. The Jesuits' direct allegiance to the papacy fueled a new era of papal theology, though. As I've mentioned, while papal power had been largely on the decline since the High Middle Ages, the Reformation led groups like the Jesuits to clamor for a more powerful papacy. And while the topic of papal authority was not mentioned at the Council of Trent, someone had to enforce all its teachings. And what better enforcer did we have than the Pope? In 1542, the Pope had established the Roman Inquisition, not to be confused with the Spanish Inquisition. The Roman Inquisition's purpose was to produce documents that clarified church teaching, or clarified Catholicism. The Roman Inquisition is actually still around today. We call it the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. One task the Council of Trent delegated to the Pope and his aides were the creation of a new missal, or a new standardization for the Mass. So in 1570, the Missal of Pope Pius V was published. Going forward, Mass was to be said in Latin with little room for improvisation or adjustment. Before this, how the Mass was said was largely dependent on where you lived. Thanks to Pope Pius V, the Mass would be said uniformly in Latin for the next 400 years regardless of where you were. The Mass of Pope Pius V is very similar to what Catholics today call the Latin Mass. During Pope Gregory XIII's reign in the 16th century, permanent nunciaries, or embassies I suppose, were established as courts to ensure Roman authority was enforced throughout Europe. Missionary activity was also centralized, and the Jesuit order experienced a golden age of evangelization and martyrdom, as they were sent to every corner of the known globe. Because of this, rather than wait for bishops or local councils to advise them, the Jesuits instead preferred invoking the Pope and his authority directly when answering questions about church teaching. Given the Pope's ambitious role behind all of this, as well as Protestantism's rejection of the papacy altogether, Catholicism basically became synonymous with the papacy. Sounds like everything was going pretty well for the papacy, eh? Not necessarily. The 16th and 17th centuries ushered in the brand new concept of democracy in Europe. This brought a gradual end of monarchies in the region, which meant there was no need for the Pope to anoint anyone as king. So the Pope's power quickly crumbled in secular states, and the few monarchies that remained didn't treat him much better. This is because the remaining kings had a tight grip over their bishops and cardinals, and any time the Pope demanded those bishops and cardinals publicly declare allegiance to him, their secular rulers would ironically suppress them. A showdown was looming. The nationalist bishops who wanted to obey their political elites versus the Jesuits who swore to bring about a formal declaration on papal supremacy over the whole church. Little did both sides know that the papacy would find an unlikely ally in one of Catholic Europe's fiercest opponents. We'll talk about that next episode. Until then, have a great day. God bless you.